Okay, so we are live. Welcome, everybody, to this wonderful Monday lunchtime talk with Dr. Pedro Noguera. We are on the virtual Indigenous Speaker Series put on by Two Feathers Native American Family Services. For those of you that are tuning in for the first time, Two Feathers is up in Humboldt County, which is about 5.5 hours north of San Francisco, right on the coast in the town of McKinleyville. And my name is Dr. Virgil Moorhead Jr. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and the behavioral health director here at Two Feathers. And I'm going to be the facilitator, the interviewer today. Unfortunately, our other host, Charlie Reed, will not be on today, but he will be back on Wednesday. And so it's my honor to really introduce Dr. Noguera, who's a distinguished professor of education at UCLA. He's written nearly a dozen books, as well as countless essays and articles on school reform, race and education, immigration, student discipline, achievement gaps, and so much more. He's taught in public schools, and recently he will be taking on a new position as the dean in the USC Education Department. Welcome, Dr. Noguera.
Thank you, Virgil. Thanks for having me on, and a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, and so we'll get started to my first question. I've thought a fair amount of how to frame this conversation, and I thought that, you know, us as Two Feathers is our agency works with Native Americans, and so primarily children and families, and we work a lot within the schools. And so my first question is about decolonizing education. I know that, you know, in a recent talk last year, you talked about in reference Carter T. Woodson, and he talked about in the miseducation of the Negro that if you tell people to sit back on the back of the bus for long enough, they start not having to be told. And so in these times, how do people that we work for, which are the marginalized, which are the communities that are struggling the most, how do we stand up and not be on the back of the bus?
Big question. Good one to start with. So that's a critical question, I think, for all oppressed people who've been through colonization to consider, because we know that education plays a role both in perpetuating oppression, because there's always a psychological component with any colonization experience, right? That is that you have to convince the colonized that they are inferior, that they are unworthy, that their path to liberation, to becoming civilized, is to embrace the Western culture, which means to negate who you are, negate everything about your experience. And so education in a colonial context always serves as a means to oppress, as a means to inflict a kind of self-hatred in that population, and to create a deep alienation from who you are, from your culture, from your language, from your traditions. And we see that around the world. We see that in any place where colonization's been carried out, we see this practice, and what goes goes along with it is a high degree of violence within our communities, because once you start to hate yourself, you start to hate each other. And so we start to see a lot of communal violence, what we call fratricide, brother against brother, sister against sister, high levels of all kinds of pathology. And that's, I think, common throughout the world. And the other side is that we know that education can play a critical role in liberation, in affirming our identities and affirming the importance of educating our children in their traditions and in their culture and in their language. And we now know that when this happens, it is a form of healing. I've spent a lot of time in New Zealand, and I've gotten to see, as the nation has embraced the Maori culture and the Maori language, and we see this at all levels, not just amongst the Maori. We're seeing the Prime Minister of New Zealand is teaching her own children in the Maori language. What we're seeing is that the country as a whole is improving, that many of the pathologies related to drugs and violence are going away. I spent time with rugby players in New Zealand, many of whom are indigenous people. And the National Rugby Foundation requires all players to mentor and give back in their communities. And what they have found is that when the athletes are required to do this, they themselves benefit. They are less likely to abuse their partners. They are less likely to engage in violence. And so the benefits are there. We're seeing the same thing. I was in Alaska a couple years ago doing work with indigenous communities there. And the only thing they have found that has begun to change the performance of kids in school, reduce the incidence of suicide, which is extremely high in indigenous communities, is a return to the language and the culture of the people. So this has not only an educational value, it has a therapeutic value in our communities. And so when we see education as a part of a decolonizing experience, it is largely about affirming the culture, the language, the traditions of the people once again, so they can return to a sense of wholeness and personhood that was previously denied as a result of colonization.
Thank you for that. And to follow up on that, I know your background is of Caribbean and Trinidad, and some of your initial work was around community development and really how to mobilize. And I mean, not so much your beginning, you still do that, but how to organize and mobilize. And so if we were to unpack a little bit what you just talked about, how would we as a community, or how do you see working within education, working within politics, working within social service agencies, what is important to organize to make change happen in your experience?
Yeah, I think it starts by recognizing that many of the traditions that came from our grandparents and their parents that we once saw as kind of the old ways are actually, there's wisdom there that we have to return to and bring back. You know, I'll give an example, because as you mentioned, my family's from the Caribbean, and my one of my nieces has recently been doing a kind of genealogy check on our family, and we also have indigenous roots, the Carib peoples and the Waru peoples, who actually originate and are still very much alive in South America, also occupied parts of the Caribbean where my people are from. In our communities, there are lots of traditions, for example, of growing your own food and of eating from your own gardens. And why was that important? It was important because it gave you access to good, healthy food. It gave you access to also the kind of herbal remedies that we know are so essential for maintaining good health. It also put you in touch with your environment and made you less dependent on the local, corner store, where you usually are only able to get really bad food that's a poor nutritional value, and which contributes to dependency. And so something as simple as a kitchen garden is, just again, one of many examples we could cite of a practice that has both health benefits, but it also puts us back in touch with our own ability to be self-sufficient. Now, if you live in the city or an apartment building, you might not be able to start your own garden. But I'm seeing people in cities. If anybody wants to take a look, there's a site for with a person. He's called the Gangster Farmer, right? And he started up farms all over South Central and LA, and he's doing it to address the food deserts that we see in so many urban areas where people don't have access to healthy food. And he's showing that even on some of these abandoned lots, we can convert them into gardens, produce organic, fresh foods that are good for us, and get kids involved in seeing that they can play a role in their communities and helping to feed people. So don't allow where you are to be a limitation on what's possible. But again, the example of the gardening is just one. I could name several others.
Yeah, and so would you say a part of that, I know one of the things that that I came across is the sort of difference between like grit and agency. And part of what I took from what you just said is self-determination and being able to develop our own, systems based on the past, based on the present. And so my question is it leadership development within our community to grow our own and to develop our own teachers, our own social workers, our own psychologists, let's say in our native community? And if that is, kind of what you're saying, like, how do we go about doing that as you see it in your 30 plus years of working within communities, I think, such as the native communities that Two Feathers works with?
Yeah. And let me again start by saying that why it's so important we think about growing our own educators. I've been doing work in New Mexico now for the last couple of years with the governor, as an advisor to the governor and to the Secretary of Education. And they have a huge problem there, a lack of teachers on the reservations. And they've been relying on Teach for America to produce teachers. And those of you who know, Teach for America, most of their recruits are young people who graduate from elite colleges, who teach for a year or two in high need areas, and then they're off to something new. And I don't want to put them down because the people who go into it usually go into it for good reasons. But the point is that they're not committed to the communities they serve because they're not from those communities. And that's what they saw in New Mexico. They were bringing in these Teach for America volunteers, and they would work for a year or two, and then they'd be gone, and they'd have to get a new batch, which meant as soon as they finally became acquainted with the community, finally got skilled at what they were doing, they were leaving the profession. And what I told the governor and the secretary and the state, I said, the only way you're going to solve the teaching shortage on the reservations is if you start producing teachers from the reservations. They said, well, where do you get them from? I said, the kids have to be trained to become the teachers. You have to start them out in elementary school, getting the older ones to tutor the little ones, and reinforce that through middle and high school, and then get them into bring teacher educators to the reservations to work with those young people to train them to become teachers because they are committed to their communities. And if you combine their training as teachers with an awareness and a knowledge of the culture, the language, the traditions of those communities, then we're going to see an education emerge on the reservations that affirms who those people are, who those children are, and provide them with the tools they need. I don't want to romanticize this. Having your garden does not really lead to self-determination. You're going to have to buy some things from the store. You're going to still need your car. You're going to still need to buy gas. So we are part of a modern society, and we're not going to go backwards. But what we have to recognize is that there are traditions that we can bring to life today. There are ways from our past that we can incorporate into our modern life. Yeah, we can use the internet, but we can use the internet to share information like we are today. We don't have to rely on simply the latest fads that come out there, because what we've seen is they can have a real harm on our community. So I'll just give an example of that. We're seeing a lot of kids right now who do have access to technology, and they're using it for video games. And they're becoming addicted to video games, and they're not getting exercise, and they're spending hours and hours in front of these screens, and it's not healthy. And we're seeing it having a damaging impact on their mental health and on their physical health. And so what we have to recognize is these technology is a tool. We can't allow it to control us. We have to use it appropriately. We have to use it with an awareness of its harmful effects, but also to maximize the benefits to ourselves and to our families. So I don't think we should see this as a question of going backwards. It's a question of applying and being aware of the traditions from our past and applying them in a new setting and a new context to address the problems we face today. You alluded to something I've written about before, which is the distinction between grit and agency. And lots of people recognize that, that part of what our kids need to learn is they need grit. They need to learn how to work hard. They need to learn how not to give up when something gets hard. not to try to take the easy path, because the easy path is not always the best path. They need to acquire discipline. All those things are important, but they're not sufficient. Hard work by itself doesn't get you where you need to go. Most of the poor people I know in this country work hard every single day of their lives, and they're still poor because they're working for low wages. They're working at very difficult jobs, and jobs that don't provide benefits, and jobs that keep them poor. What our kids need is not simply grit. They need critical thinking. They need to recognize the obstacles that they face and their families face are real, and they need to be able to strategize. How do I overcome those obstacles? How do I use education to solve problems that plague my family, that plague my community? That's agency. And the difference between agency and grit is that agency is collective. It's not just about what I do as an individual, it's about what we do together. How do we work together to solve these problems? Because we have a tendency in America to kind of glorify the individual, the rugged individual, that person who is able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and make something of themselves. And you know, I don't want to take anything away from people like that. But every time we pull ourselves up, we need to pull somebody up with us, whether they be a relative, a friend, a neighbor, an elder in our community. We have to have a compassion and a sense of solidarity and commitment to others, because it's not good enough to see one or two people succeed while many others stay behind. And so agency reminds us that we're in this together, that we have to use our privileges and our education to benefit others. And that is the kind of education that we so sorely need right now.
Thank you for that. So that sort of leads to another question that I had. You know, at Two Feathers, we're working up on the reservation, and a lot of the youth that we're working with are high school age, and a lot of the youth that I'm working with are young, sort of adolescent Native males, and a lot of them are, you know, essentially dropping out. Not a lot, but some. And the ones that are not going to school or struggling the most are often those that have experienced complex trauma, that are in abject poverty, that there's a lot of structural injustices that they've faced throughout their life, and it's often intergenerational. And so, like, with that, how do you go about developing agency or motivation? Like, my thought is, like, sometimes is it too late? But that, I don't want to be sort of pessimistic and give up on any kid, but that's kind of a struggle that we've been coming across, in the sense of, like, where are the solutions when there's been intergenerational complex trauma and poverty in many of these kids' lives?
Yeah, you know, it comes down to helping a person to reflect on their life and their circumstances, and not merely, I want to say this tactfully, not merely being in touch with the trauma. The trauma is real, and people who've experienced adversity and adverse childhood experiences, whether it be divorce, abuse, neglect, homelessness, we can go on down the list of the kinds of trauma many of our kids have experienced. And so we want to acknowledge that and provide people with help, counseling, so they can talk it through and think it through. But we don't want them to develop a sense of helplessness because of that. Helplessness leaves you in that state of trauma. What we want to do is help people to get in touch with their blessings and the ways in which they still have assets. They still have strengths despite the trauma. You might have been through that, but you are still alive. You still have a body. You still have your health. You still have family and loved ones. We all still have some strengths. And we have to, what we know about resilience in kids, it's by tapping into their strengths, by helping them to acquire a sense of competence so that they can experience accomplishment, whether it be in reading, whether it be in art, whatever it is, dance, something that allows them to experience a sense of accomplishment. That's where your self-esteem comes from. And we need to lift up their self-esteem to counter the way in which it's been beaten down by life circumstances. And that will ultimately help them to become resilient, because resilience is not simply about ignoring the hardships you faced. It's about building on your assets and your strengths so that you're not weighted down by the hardships you faced. So let me just give an example, because I've worked with young people at who have faced these kinds of issues throughout much of my career. And early on, I spent time teaching in the Bay Area at continuation schools. And for those of you who are familiar with continuation schools, you know that many of those young people have been through it. They failed in school. They're not attending school regularly. Some of them have been incarcerated, been arrested. Some of them are teen parents themselves. They're going through it. And that's one of the reasons why traditional schools don't work for them. So we spent time, I spent 3 years with a continuation school in the Bay Area. And what we realized is, first of all we were offering these kids was a remedial education. Remedial math, remedial reading, remedial writing. And what that suggested is that we confused being low skilled with being unintelligent. These were not unintelligent people we were working with. These were young people who had life skills, who had street smarts, who were figuring out how to cope with adversity on their own. And what we said is we need to provide these kids with an education that will enhance those kinds of skills they bring with us, that will show them how to use education to improve their lives. And so we started to think, well, okay, what can we do to support these kids? Well, at the time, I worked with the mayor's office in Berkeley, and I knew there was a biotech firm, Bayer Laboratories, that was trying to expand operations in Berkeley. And I knew that they were in negotiations with the city because I had been involved in those negotiations. And so I decided I would go right to the CEO of the company and propose that they create a biotech academy for our kids at this continuation school. And because they're a German firm, and because in Germany, technical preparation starts when kids are in high school, he said, this makes so much more sense than anything the city's proposed. They just want parking. We want trained workers who can work in biotech. This was in 1988. In biotech at that time, you started out making $16 an hour, right? But to get there, you had needed 4 years of science, 4 years of math, which most people said that's unheard of for the kids at a continuation school. We said, no, we're not gonna just make it a traditional math and science course. We're gonna have hands-on learning. We're gonna have kids learning in the workplace, mentored by experienced technicians so they could learn. And lo and behold, you put these kids in white coats and goggles and they start to see themselves as scientists too. And that career and technical education is now a national model. 30 years later, we have kids from 7 different high schools who also are learning in community colleges and earning good salaries in biotech. And not every kid's gonna be interested in biotech, but the point of this story is that we didn't sit around and wait. We looked outside of the school to ask, where are the opportunities that we can connect our kids with? Our kids have a real pressing need for employment. They need to support themselves and their families. We can't ignore that need. So let's get creative as we think about how can our kids use their education to help themselves, help their communities, and show that we can, in fact, begin to solve some of the problems that we face.
Nice. So part of this speaker series is unpacking the processes, or the motivation behind this speaker series at Two Feathers is unpacking the processes of what works, whether it's in mental health or education. And I know one of the things that you've talked about in your books and sort of the pillars of getting stuff done in education is leadership. And your example, I think, talked about leadership. And so the importance of leadership in changing school districts or changing organizational culture or the culture within schools. And so I just wanted to see if you can unpack a little bit more what kind of leadership you think it takes to make changes and develop academies in schools like you just described.
Well, that's a good question because, as you said in the introduction, I just chose to become a dean, and I'd held off on that kind of role before. I'm going to become the dean of the Rossier School of Education at USC on July 1st. And I would say up until that point, I've largely been leading from the side. In the case I described a little while ago of that continuation school, I was an instigator, but I was not the leader. I was not the principal. I was not the superintendent. But I want to remind folks, the listeners out there, even if don't have the formal title of leader, you can be the person who comes up with ideas. You can still be the person who helps to facilitate change and helps to organize and empower others. So you don't have to wait until you have a formal position of leadership. But if some of you do hold formal positions of leadership, I think the key is going to be vision and creativity. We can't just focus on doing things by the rules, because the way the rules are set up keeps us exactly where we are. So I'll give you another example from that same continuation school. We had a problem at the school a while back of kids who would leave for lunch and not come back after lunch. They would go off campus to get food. Some would go off and smoke weed. They told us directly. They said, after lunch, I'm too tired, I'm high, I don't want to come back and go to school anymore. So the principal was at a loss. What should we do? And some board members were saying, you need to build a fence around the school and not let the kids out at lunchtime. And he knew that would just cause some confrontation with the kids, because the food available to the kids at the school was one of the things the kids complained about. All they offered was a bunch of junk food. And so instead of putting up a fence, he had a town hall meeting with the kids. And he said, we need to find a way to keep you in school. We can't just have you missing half the day. What can we do that would make you want to stay at the school? And they said, well, let's change the food. Let's get some better food here. And he says, well, how can we change the food? They said, well, one of our kids' moms makes barbecue, and she's a cook. And he said, how about if she ran our cafeteria instead of relying on the district? And they started it up. They started their own cafe at the school, staffed by a parent, and kids worked there with her. Teachers and kids eating together. Everybody enjoyed the food, and kids were staying in school. And they, in effect, closed the campus without a fence. And so if you think about it, how did this happen? It happened because the leader in charge had the courage to listen to the kids. And it takes courage because you have to acknowledge that sometimes you don't have all the answers, and that maybe working with the people you're trying to lead is the best way to lead, rather than think I'm going to impose my will upon them. But beyond that, he was willing to draw upon the parents as an ally in supporting the school. He was willing to think outside the box instead of literally building a box around that school. And because they came up with a more humane approach to feeding the students and to keeping them in school. And so I want to encourage those of you who work with schools that struggle. Some of our schools struggle with helping kids to learn. They struggle with discipline. But I'd say part of the reason why they struggle is because they go about it the wrong way. And so many of our schools, what do we do to a kid who acts out? We send them home. We suspend them, as if going home and watching television is going to be an effective form of discipline. It's crazy if you think about it. We're sending kids home who don't like school in the first place. And then we're wondering why nothing has changed. Well, nothing has changed because we never addressed the cause of the problem. And if the cause of the problem is that kids are bored, or if the cause of the problem is that kids are feeling hopeless, because their education is not really speaking to their needs, then that's what we need to focus on changing, and not just coming up with new ways of punishing kids. So it does mean that we've got to be more creative in how we think about the challenges we face, and be willing to consider some new ideas, but we also need to be willing to evaluate those ideas to make sure that they're actually effective.
Mhm. That makes sense. And speaking of discipline, and I'm wondering how to go about discipline in an effective way. It must be tied to equity, like in your work around equity, and it's not just about the behavior, that it's about all the other things that come into influencing the kid's life. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, absolutely. I would say that whenever you're disciplining a student, a student acts out, a student, cuts class, a student cusses at a teacher, fights with another kid, the first thing we've got to do is figure out why. Why did it happen? What's behind the behavior? The behavior doesn't speak for itself. If a kid hits another kid, you don't know what preceded that. Was there name calling that happened first? Maybe that kid's been harassed and teased every day, and we need to deal with that. You first got to figure out why. We've all seen kids who may act out in the classroom because they're bored. Simply putting them out of class is not going to solve that problem. So we've got to figure out why a child might be acting out. And then we need to make sure that whatever response, and sometimes there need to be real consequences. Kids who fight each other need to learn that fighting is not a way to resolve their conflicts. Otherwise, we'll see the fighting escalate. So we need to make sure that they learn the lesson and that they have tools so they can address their conflicts differently, learn to communicate, to work things out. They also, if we think that they need to be some consequences for inappropriate behavior, the consequences should be designed to teach a lesson. I would say community service is a much better form of consequence. If a kid has been writing graffiti in the bathroom, then how about they work with a custodian for a few weeks to keep the school clean, so they can learn how important it is to keep the environment clean. If a child has been rude and disrespectful to a teacher, how about if for the next week they have to work with that teacher to help keep the classroom orderly and to keep the supplies in place. So let's make the consequences meaningful. Let's make sure the consequences do in fact teach the moral and ethical lessons our kids need so they can grow up to be healthy, responsible adults. That's our goal. We know we're doing discipline right when we see changes in behavior. Because the goal of discipline should be to help kids to become self-disciplined. So they don't have to be watched and told what to do. They know what to do on their own.
Mm-hmm. And is there some good models of that you're familiar with, of districts, changing their approaches to discipline and having good results?
There are. I'm seeing it at some of the schools I work with here in Los Angeles. Several schools have implemented restorative justice in their schools. Some of them, I'll tell you honestly, not very effectively, because they think it's just a new approach to discipline, and they forget that restorative justice only works if you produce a change in the whole culture of the school. You improve the relationships between teachers and kids. When that happens, then restorative justice can become transformative in a school. I work with a school that does just that, Social Justice Academy in Los Angeles. And it's the only high school in LA where the kids evaluate the teachers. They evaluate them each semester, each quarter, give them feedback. And the kids are always constructive, but they don't hold back in letting teachers know when the teachers are disorganized or when they're not clear about what they're doing. And because of that, the relationships between adults and kids are strong, they're authentic, they're honest. This is a school that has the 4th highest graduation rate in Los Angeles. Even though 100% of the kids are low income, over half the kids are recent immigrants, many of them are undocumented. They haven't had a fight at this school in 7 years. 7 years, right? This was before the pandemic. And the first thing they did when they knew they were going to shut down schools because of the pandemic, they started contacting kids, say, what do you need? What kind of supports do you need to help you during this period? Because they knew that many kids will be struggling and their families will be struggling. So when you look at a school like this and you see how the relationships have been forged and sustained even during this period, you start to realize that the good results they get in terms of academic performance and in terms of discipline are a byproduct of the culture of that school. Mm-hmm. And that's what our schools need to work on, building a strong, positive culture where teachers and kids feel supported and where the climate is conducive to good teaching and learning.
Mm-hmm. And so in many indigenous communities, there's a, historically, and I think currently, there's a real respect towards children and elders. And, one of the things that I'm getting from what you're saying is in our world, within like mental health and youth development, there's the positive youth development framework. But, really it seems like it's about listening to the kids is what I'm hearing you say is that part of that positive culture. There has to be a respect and listening to the youth. Am I getting that correct?
Yeah, I would say that's got to be part of it, right? Because we don't know how the young people perceive things and how they're seeing the world and the challenges they face. So we've got to listen. We've got to open up the communication so that they know we care about what they're going through. At the same time, I think it would be a mistake to think the kids have the solutions. They may not. They will be able to name the problem that they're experiencing, but the solution might be something that we need to work on together, or we might need to learn from elsewhere and say, well, how have they approached this problem? Because we may not be able to find the answers where we are. So, but I think a good starting point is opening up the communication. I'll give you one example. I was invited to a community, New Bedford, Massachusetts, a few years ago, where they'd been having a problem with youth violence and homicides amongst young people. And they asked me if I'd come to work with them to address the problem. And I said, I'll come on one condition. And the condition is that we have all of the stakeholders who are affected in the room while I'm there. And that has to include the kids, parents, teachers, the cops, the courts, the rec centers. They all have to be there. They said, why? I said, because they all are going to be part of the solution. The solution is not going to come from just one place. Every person, and a part of the process of developing a solution is listening, is communicating with each other about what we're seeing. And so they agreed, and I came out there and we had a day-long seminar where we heard from young people, because the truth was a lot of adults didn't know why kids were getting killed. What was behind the rise in violence amongst young people. And what we started to hear is this great sense of demoralization, this hopelessness, this sense that the kids thought they had no future other than to just leave their community because they didn't see any opportunity for them there. And many of them were just drinking on the weekends and using drugs, and all of that was contributing to the climate of violence. And then it was very interesting because New Bedford is an old whaling community, but it's also now a place where there are a lot of fisheries, and they have these fish factories, and it's hard work. And a lot of those fish factories have jobs. And there was a Salvadoran there. He said, listen, when I first came here, I was undocumented. I didn't speak English, and I worked in those fish factories. And it was dirty work, and I hate the smell of fish now because of it. He said, but I did it, and I saved my money, and now I own my own business. And many of you come to my restaurant where I serve food, and now I can hire some of these kids to work with me. He says, what we've got to realize is that although we might be facing a lot of hardships, there are opportunities here too. And people looked at him because they had overlooked that. And I think that a lot of times immigrants bring a kind of fresh perspective to our communities because they understand sacrifice, they understand hardship. They're often the ones who do the jobs that Americans won't do. They're the ones working in the fields. They're the ones risking their lives right now during this pandemic. They're the meat packers and being exposed to this virus. But many immigrants also bring incredible resilience with them too. And the research shows, for example, in health, that those immigrants a lot of times are healthier than the people who've been here longer because they eat well, they work hard, they take care of themselves and each other, they rely on traditional practices to do that. There's a lot we can learn. And by opening up a dialogue in our community where we include all stakeholders like we did in New Bedford, what starts to happen is we start to see we have more resources, more assets than we realized before. We don't have to wait for someone to save us. We can work and to start saving ourselves by turning to each other rather than turning on each other.
Thank you for that. So that kind of brings me to, the title that you had given me for our talk today is, what is educating, equitably during and after the pandemic. And so today, we have some, I would say, administrators, some university professors and other school personnel or teachers, and as well as some people on the school board tuning in. And so, what does, at a system-wide level, educating equitable during and after the pandemic, mean for you, and the reason for, using that as a title for today?
So equity for me starts by acknowledging that we're not all equal. Some of us face greater challenge than others. Equity work is about compensating for those challenges and helping people to so they can access education fully despite the circumstances they're in. So right now, for example, we have kids out there who are at homes with no internet access. That's a huge challenge. How are you going to participate in distance learning if you don't have the internet, or if you don't have a device, a screen device at home that you can use? Some kids are working off their telephones, obviously not equal to having a laptop to work on. So that's a huge challenge. Who are those kids in your communities that right now can't even participate because they don't have access? What are we doing to reach out to them? I'm seeing districts where principals and teachers are going out to their homes and getting kids hotspots and getting them devices and getting donations to come in because there's lots of people who have extra screens at home. So again, what we're seeing is in communities where there are resourceful leaders, people are stepping up to respond to the needs we know are there. That needs to happen more systematically. I wish the governor would speak about the need for this to happen across the state. We live in a wealthy state. California is not broke. California is home to Silicon Valley and Elon Musk and Disneyland and Hollywood. We can't pretend to be broke. We have resources here, vast private resources. How do we use those to help those in need right now? And that's the kind of leadership we need at the state level. But at the local level, we need to make sure that we're drawing on those who have more privilege to help those who have less. And to the degree that we're doing that, we're going to be able to address the equity issues that have appeared now and that will reappear right after this is over. Because when we go back to school, there'll be lots of kids who have been stressed out, who haven't been learning, and who may not be ready to go to school as we've known it. And there, it's going to be really critical that we are attentive to their social and emotional needs when they come back, that we work hard to build a sense of trust and community in our schools with our kids. And then we don't just go back to just the same approaches of education where we're just covering material. We got to find ways to tap into the curiosity of kids so they become active participants in their education. Get away from the passive learning, take on a more active approach to learning so that kids can see the real value in what they're learning and start to see themselves as problem solvers and not merely as kids who take tests. I can give you lots of examples of how to do that, but the main point is to see education as a means to empower young people and not merely to prepare them for the next grade. Thank
you. And, I know you're a parent of, is it 4 or 5?
I got 5.
Five children.
One at home right now.
Okay, one at home. And so you're, in the midst of this at multiple levels as a leader, but also as in the education field and also a parent. And so I know there's, parents out here listening to us right now. And, what would you say, because we're talking about the importance of kids and youth having agency. And what would you recommend or what have to say for the parents out there during these times? I follow you on Facebook and Twitter, and I know that, that's one thing that you're doing is providing excellent articles and stuff for parents to read. So just wondering what your, recommendations are for parents.
I think the main thing, if you have the time, now that's a big if, because some parents are working at home or they're out of the house working, so they're not present. But if you're around and you are present, try to read to your kids or read while they read. Get some time where we're just reading. Imagine how much further along they would be if every kid was reading independently during this period, which means we need to make sure they have things they want to read, access to them. So I would start there. I would also start to think about activities you can do with your kids. Instead of just you doing the cooking, have them cook with you. Teach them so they're learning about, how to manage a home. Yesterday we let my daughter, she's picky eater. And we said, okay, you get to cook your own dinner tonight. And she made scrambled eggs with fruit. And we said, well, that's at least healthy. So we'll go with that for tonight. Tomorrow night, you might want to not just eat eggs again. And we're going to put the responsibility on her. We'll work with her to try to get the ingredients, but we want food to be a pleasant experience for her. And we want her to learn about food and cooking and nutrition in the process. So I would say there are lots of, the one thing about this pandemic is it's giving families a chance to be together more. Mm-hmm. And the question is, what are we doing with that time? Are we all just locked into screens and watching movies and TV, or are we using a time for good interaction that builds our own relationships as a family, but also that helps us to become the guides that our children need. So I've been struggling with that as well. And my daughter pushes back a lot. She's complains about the distance learning. So I told her, I said, look, if you don't like what they're doing in school, we can do an activity together. So we're going to start a research project on viruses because she's very curious about pandemics. And so we started learning about the smallpox virus and how that was used as a weapon against indigenous people in this country. We then were learning about yellow fever as a major pandemic that affected this country in the 19th century, and then the Spanish influenza in the early 20th century. And I'm learning as much as she is as we do this. So there are great things you can do with your child other than simply tell them to listen to the teacher. But it does take some work, but it's worth the time, I find.
Yeah, I have a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old at home. And so when I have to come over to my work here at Two Feathers to do the webinars, because they come crashing in through the door to say hello to daddy. But I think, it has been a challenge, but what I found is that it's kind of good to be able to stay at home and just connect with your kids. Cause, before the pandemic, we were all busy just going from one place to another. So that's what I've found. So I see we have a little bit of time left at about 10 minutes. And so I had a couple other questions that I was going to ask, and then, maybe some final thoughts from you. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me. So
sort of more broadly speaking, and you've kind of already touched about this, but I just think that maybe it's important for our viewers to hear is, what do you see as the purpose of education?
So the purpose of education is always twofold, as I see it. On the one hand, we want to use education to prepare kids for the world they live in, right? Which means having the knowledge and skills they'll need to survive and hopefully to thrive, right? And we know that means strong literacy, strong problem-solving ability, so that they're not stuck in low-wage jobs. So that's very important. It's practical, it's essential, but it's not sufficient. Because we also need education to be the place where kids learn to become critical thinkers. They have to be learned to be problem solvers. They have to develop creativity. And the reason why they need those skills is because our kids are going to have to solve the problems that we couldn't solve, right? We are passing on to them huge problems in our environment related to climate change, problems related to disease and healthcare, problems in our economy. We can go on down the list. We have so many problems we're passing on to our kids. So the knowledge that we have now is not good enough because that's what produced these problems. Our kids are going to have to think outside the box. They're going to have to be creative. They're going to have to be resourceful. And so we need to make sure that the learning they engage in develops creativity and resourcefulness and not just regurgitating what they have learned from others. So we've got to make time for both. And that's the reason why I think creative expression has got to be a part of education, and that we've got to make sure that all kids have an opportunity to do that too.
And so part of that is, I would guess, is igniting some passion and motivation to learn and just curiosity. And one piece of this interview that we haven't touched on is teachers. And so what is, during these times and in 2020, like how do you see effective teachers being able to, despite the constraints and the structural inequities in our society, succeed in being able to develop that creativity and the critical thinking skills that is necessary to have make changes in this world?
So, it's really unfortunate what we've done to teachers in the last several years, because basically we've used pressure on teachers and told them that the most important thing is raising test scores, which has led teachers to focus on test preparation and killed their creativity. And so what we have to do is send a different message to teachers. Tell them your job is to get kids excited about learning, period. That's your job. Get the kids excited about learning. And here's the good news. And you see this already because you said you have a 2-year-old at home. They come to us excited about learning. What's the most common question you've ever heard from a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old?
What's that?
What's that? Why? Why do I have to take a bath? Why do I have to eat broccoli? Why is the sky blue? Kids are naturally curious. They want to learn. And so what we've got to do is go back to that. How do we use curiosity as a driver for learning, as a way to get kids motivated to learn? And when you start to think that way, what you start to realize is that kids can become independently motivated learners if you tap into that curiosity, right? But it does take work on the part of the teacher to think through, okay, how do I make this interesting? How do I make it relevant? What questions do I need to pose when I'm teaching this subject so the kids will want to learn it, right? It's not good enough to cover the material. We have to create lessons that entice kids into learning. That's what we should be doing. And the arts are a great way to do that. Music's a great way to do that. Experiential learning is a great way to do that. There are lots of ways. And if you want resources, I'm happy to share some with you.
And, I think for our own community too, is that's where that culturally relevant, the stories and the practice of our own, local tribal people in this area come into play, because it seems like a lot of the youth, or in my experience, a lot of the youth, what they're interested, a big part of is learning, what it means to be a Native person, and learning they're interested in their history.
Absolutely. And I think that, exposing them to that history and helping them to see it, it will be so important for cultivating in them a desire to learn more about who they are and who their people are. And that the benefits of that just can't be underestimated, because when kids have a solid foundation in their identity, they go into the world with confidence and clarity about who they are, and they're able to solve problems and give back to others. So I really want to encourage parents to use your grandparents as a resource. If they're around, they can be great mentors for kids. They can explain the herbal remedies that the families have been relying on for years. They can explain how they survived as a child growing up and what it was like. And so let's treat our elders with the respect so that they can, in fact, contribute to supporting our children during these times.
And one of my last questions is, keeping it local. I think one of the policies or the things that our community has is mobilized around, and I believe that you believe this is a good policy, is the LCAP. And,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering, just sort of, since we already have buy-in from our community in the sense of showing up to the meetings and trying to hold our district accountable as well as the state, like, what are your thoughts about the LCAP and what you like about it, and the ways that our community can continue to use that as a tool to advance equity in our communities?
Well, what I like about the LCAP is that it brings additional resources to communities that need them. It's what we should have been doing all along, but so at least finally California is saying, look, those who have least, the least should get more than they have before. And it doesn't totally level the playing field, but it starts us down that path. So now the question is, when we get extra monies, how are they used? And who has a seat at the table to make those decisions? And in the communities where parents and kids and teachers are at the table, I see better decisions being made, because those who are most affected have a voice, and they're able to say, these are what our needs are. This is what would help us. And so make sure that that's happening in your community, that parents and kids and teachers are at the table and that their voices are being heard, because when that happens, we're more likely to develop solutions that really do address our needs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so the final question, trying to go back to the heart and being just curious, like what keeps you going, or what got you into this work, and doing an interview like, right now, just, with somebody of your esteemed status, and just, you seem like such a advocate and fighter for social justice. And so the question is like, what keeps you going? What motivates you? What drives you? And how others may take from you and your experience to keep fighting the good fight?
Well, I kind of got into education almost accidentally as a young person in college. I took a psychology course, and I was asked to work with a teacher and help a teacher in a kindergarten classroom with kids who they said were disruptive. And the teacher said, I could do whatever I want with those kids, just get her out of her hair. And I learned immediately that the only problem those kids had was they were restless. They had trouble sitting still. And so I just went about building relationships with those kids. I started doing it through sports, playing football with them, and really helping them to release and channel their energy in good, productive ways. And what I learned then is that building relationships with kids is really the essence of educating kids. And when we do that, education can be powerful. And so I still see education as one of the best ways we can make a difference in our society and for our future. And that keeps me going. That keeps me aware of the fact that the work we do in education is the best thing we can do to overcome the hopelessness, overcome the fear, and the foreboding we have about our future. So many people, I think, are afraid right now about this pandemic because they think the zombie apocalypse is here, that the world as we've known it is going to be destroyed. And I would say that could happen, or we could choose to use this experience to go in another direction. And I hope that more people will see that we can choose a different direction than the path we're on. The path we've been on was not sustainable anyway. We need to choose a different way, a way that is more affirming of our humanity, that is more in sync with nature and the environment, and that is more just and equitable than what we've known before. And if we do that, I think the future can be brighter.
Thank you. Very moving. Good last words. And so I just want to thank you, Dr. Noguera, for taking the time out of your day to speak with me and our community. I truly appreciate it. And, based on some of the comments and texts, I think people are really enjoying what you had to say. I know I have. I've been following your work for many years. And, you just seem real and down for the good fight. So thank you.
Thank you, Virgil. Thanks for having me. And if people want to check, my Facebook page is Pedro E. Noguera, PhD. You can go, I post resources, as Virgil mentioned, articles, things you can use to help your kids, help yourself during this period. So I want to thank you.
You're on Twitter too.
On Twitter too.
Yes,
All right.
and good luck on your new position. I'm sure USC is really glad to take you from their arch rival UCLA.
Thank you.
All right. And for those of you that are tuning into our speaker series, we're going to have local cultural leader Julian Lang on Wednesday and educator Sandy Grand on Thursday. So tune in. That'll be at 1 o'clock on Wednesday and 12 o'clock on Thursday. Thank you.